I make films almost primarily about the experiences of women or females, because some are young women. And in particular, I like to make films about the experiences of, I call them like difficult women or unruly women or women in transition. And I oftentimes like to make films that suggest that coming of age is a lifelong process. I came to filmmaking through art school, so I didn't go to film school. You know, for both my undergrad and graduate degrees, I went to an art school, so I was always making films. I never did anything else. I was always making films or moving image work. But I was surrounded by people who were doing painting and sculpture and performance, photography, you know, it's installation, etc. So for whom, like, where maybe a story was important to me, to them what was important were, you know, light, color, texture, performativity, you know, etc. And, you know, I couldn't help but just be influenced by that. And even still, you know, making films in an art school, I took many more art history classes than I did film history, for instance, you know. I mean, I like to think that I know my film history now as an educator, but again, I mean, the conversations that I had primarily in classrooms were about more traditional visual art, studio art. So as much as I have no interest in studio art as a practice for myself, all that stuff like creeps into my filmmaking, you know. So for instance, I use a lot of props to fill in some of the narrative gaps. And I think some of that comes right out of conversations about, you know, sculpture. And I feel really committed to the art direction or the lighting or the color palette of the films. And that's not to say that other filmmakers don't think about that, but having been surrounded for so long by people for whom color is what, you know, gets them up in the morning, you know, it's like it's been really influential. And I think it's also allowed me to I've never really understood the rules of filmmaking, because it was not part of sort of like that my canon, you know. It was like, here's a camera and go make some things, you know. Because, you know, certainly the kind of moving image work that I was doing was either much more experimental, or it was coming from, you know, the history of video art. I feel like video art isn't really even a term that exists so much anymore, you know, which was so much about, you know, intuition and sort of playing with the camera or in front of the camera or experimentation. And even though I feel like I feel committed to narrative filmmaking and storytelling and more traditional, accessible filmmaking and storytelling, I resist the rules somehow. And maybe I don't even know the rules, you know, maybe I suggested that before. I'm not even sure what the rules are necessarily. But I think it's allowed me to sort of bring any instinct that I have in terms of how to tell the story the best way possible. You know, it's like, well, that can all go in there. We can all go in there and we'll figure out a way for it to fit. Having come from art school, I appreciate art in the world that so often has no actual physical function sometimes, you know. It's simply to deliver an experience to an audience, or sometimes to provide, you know, pleasure, or to sort of transport your, you know, soul somehow. And all of those things are important, but it's not something that, right, when you're sort of teaching someone how to make a film, or when you're reading again about how to make a film, that, you know, they say within that 3-act structure, make sure to inject some artfulness and some place for someone to connect their soul, you know. But I think it's the influence of art and wanting to make something that aesthetically has, you know, reverberation. Usually the initial germ for a film comes from something grounded in people or a character. So it could be a line of dialogue, it could be a sort of a moment between two people, sometimes it's something that I've observed in real life, sometimes it's something that I've experienced, or that I've read about. But it's normally like something about one character, or one person, like a human, and then I start to think, well, who is that person, and how did they come to say that thing or do that thing? So it can start off with this very idiosyncratic, small kind of moment. And then usually the way that I write is not a linear way. It's like it sort of builds out in these kind of spirals, that I then eventually sort of like try to tether together. So, for instance, in my film A Million Miles Away, I just had this, I have been for a couple of films interested in people who are having a kind of public breakdown, like right in the moment, and that they shouldn't have the breakdown. And so I was thinking, gosh, when would be the most inopportune time to kind of burst into tears? Well, it might be when you are a substitute teacher. You're already everyone's ready to sort of bring you down. And so just that little moment, that seems like, oh, I want to see this person break down in front of a class. Well, what's the class doing? And then how did she get there? And why is she, so all of these kind of questions. It's like being I've said this before, it's like being a detective, but you're also kind of planting all of the evidence and also actually the arbiter of the crime to begin with. And then the one of my most recent completed shorts, Crystal Lake, came from some place that's actually rooted in reality. I was looking at these great images that were coming out of Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan of girls who, hijabi Muslim girls, teenage girls, and younger girls even, who were forming these packs of like skate clubs, skateboarding clubs. And there were these beautiful images of girls with sort of traditional Afghani dresses, their jeans, their their shoes, their hijabs with like skateboard helmets on, and their skateboards. And it was such a beautiful image of a young Muslim, a young hijabi feminist, sort of making her way in the world and kind of circumventing the rules of her culture and religion while still staying completely within them. And so I thought, how do I make a film that takes everything that I love about American teen culture and sort of incorporate this image of, like a hijabi skateboarding girl, and talk about, aspects of feminism and culture and feminism and religion. And so again, it sort of starts with this little thing, just the image of that person, and then kind of figuring out what their story is, and doing that maybe that more proper thing where you sort of figure out the kind of plot progression and how it begins and how it ends. So it's all these. It's a very idiosyncratic thing that turns into a spiral, and those spirals connect, and hopefully then eventually you've got something that's a script that's producible, and footage then that can be edited to something that really speaks to an audience. It's notebooks often, and they literally, they don't take the form of a spiral, but they do take the form of like a flow chart, So it's like a thing here, and then it kind of has these little things that come off of it. And sometimes those things end up in like a dead end, right? And it's like, oh no, it's not, that's not in that direction. It's going this way. And so it does have this way of kind of, building out from one thing, as opposed to something that's, there's like that's linearly back and forth. Mm-hmm. So, but I take notes, I just have, dozens and dozens of notebooks full of things that are, scrawled notes. I oftentimes, now I've become a little more electronic, so I often will text notes to myself, but then later I have forgotten that I've done that, and so I'll look at my phone, I'm like, oh, I got a text message, and I'll open it up and it'll say something very odd, like, she, like, crossing the street naked. I'm like, who is sending me? Oh, I sent that to myself. I've done that so many times that I have forgotten what the note is, and it's a kind of a cryptic and particular note. Yeah, my process is very organic, but then when it comes down to putting all that into a script form, I'm very particular. I'm very particular about the dialogue. I don't think that my dialogue is actually very naturalistic. I think my dialogue is pretty stylized. But I don't allow for a lot of improv in my actors. I've written it that way, and I want them to say it that way. Anytime there's what seems like a very particular prop in the film, or something on someone's sweatshirt, a mug, a book they're reading, something that's in the background, all that stuff is always in the script. That's never an accident. So even though the process is, really intuitive at the beginning and really organic, what gets sort of like filtered down and sifted down and compressed down becomes really particular. And then I actually find that in the post-production process, the editing process, things loosen up again, and it's more, again, like, even though we're laying things into the timeline in the order that they're supposed to go, things always change position. What I think has to be the beginning of the film, sometimes at some point I look to my editor and I say, this is all wrong. This is the wrong beginning. The beginning is the third scene, and we have to swap them. And I always am like astounded that I didn't figure that out in the script writing process. So it goes from like organic to rigid to sort of organic again in the editing process. I do have an interest in doing a documentary, and I've put together a proposal for a short doc, but it's related to the fiction narratives that I've done, and I want to do a very kind of formal observational documentary about girls' bedrooms, sort of from all over. If I did one in Chicago, it would be everything from like the South Side to the North Side, and really looking at different ways, how different girls sort of art direct their own rooms or the spaces where they sleep. I wouldn't presume that every girl has her own room by any means. So it would be related to sort of what I'm interested in, and how girlhood manifests, through what actual girls' actual rooms look like. So I'm interested in a documentary that could do both of those things. But I like fiction because I kind of like making things up, and I like taking the real thing and using it as a point of inspiration, but then sort of putting a bunch of my other stuff in there. It's like, in a way, it's like cooking. I love, love, love to cook. I am a terrible baker because baking is so precise. I really am. It's humbling. If I need some humbling, I try and even just make a muffin or cookies. Even I'm terrible at that because it doesn't allow for any kind of improvisation. And so I do. I like fiction. I like narrative because you can just twist the truth. And I don't know, I appreciate that. I think it's something that I was born with, a kind of fascination with the make-believe and fantasy and fantastical world. It's a really great way to escape the real. As a teacher, I always tell my students, I ask my students, who's your audience? Or I tell them, be concerned with your audience. As a maker, I think I make films. I think I make films actually for a very specific audience, and then I'm always so surprised and grateful that a much larger audience appreciates what I'm doing. So at the very basic level, I could say that the recent shorts that I've made are for teenage girls. They're shorts. It's actually very hard to kind of get, girls to consume short films. They're mostly going into the theater watching feature-length films, and I don't know that there's a lot of teenage girls sitting around on a Saturday morning trolling around on the internet for short experimental narratives necessarily. However, when I have had audiences of teenage girls, they've been really responsive, and they have said exactly what I would hope, that they connected with those characters, or they felt validated through those characters. And it's like, that's the easiest thing for me to do sometimes, is just to keep thinking, how, as I'm making decisions, maybe in the script writing process or the shooting or the editing, is this, does this feel authentic for a teen experience? Weighing it against all the other sort of mainstream studio films that are made for teenagers that I think are maybe quite likable and popular among teenagers, but do they feel authentic to them, you know? Yeah, and so then I think if I do my job right, ultimately they're stories about characters who are just trying to do what everyone who's even not a teenage girl wants to do, right? Which is to kind of be seen and be heard and find their way through the world. So yeah, so I've been really fortunate that I've had in Q&As lots of people who are the antithesis of a teen girl come up to me and say how much they were, I don't know, engaged with the film or that they liked the film, etc. I think that is why I have done a good job writing for teenage girls, because it just, like, the access to 14 is very close to me, you know? But I also write films that contrast the experience of a young girl against adults, and in this case, in the recent shorts, against adult women who are not, who are also in a kind of a time of transition, and oftentimes to flip who's more dysfunctional, so that the adult woman is sort of having a harder time kind of coping with her day to day than the hormonally charged teen is, and the teen has all the right answers on some level. And I think that's partially because I really do think that we, outside of artfulness or filmmaking, just as a cultural and a culture in general, we disregard the agency of young people and don't think that they should have as much agency over their life or intellectual response to their own, existence, when I think they know exactly, what's happening to them, and maybe even more so what's happening to the adults around them. And I've seen this when I was shooting, in the film Blood Below the Skin, there's the young woman, one of the leads, is dealing with her mother, who's sort of just kind of is not functioning. She's like in the middle of a pretty severe kind of ongoing crisis, and she sort of helps her mother out of the crisis, or ostensibly says, you need to kind of pull it together, for all of us. And in real life, that young woman in her real life was also sort of, her mother was going through like a second divorce and was, beside herself with sorrow and depression. And so I didn't will that to happen in her real life because I wrote it in the script, but I thought this is a real thing that young people are dealing with, parents who are also, are sort of paralyzed with their own, life crises and not able to kind of parent to their full ability. And yeah, so I wanted to flip it. I feel like we're so used to stories where the parent, the adult knows best, and the adult sort of saves the young person. And I like flipping that. So like the girls are the heroes at the end of the story. So the recent films that I have, the recent shorts that I have made, I've used the same DOP for the past like 5 or 6 films. And I've tried to use the same actors often until they get too old to be believable as teenagers. The same sound guy. And partially like so many people, I'm a little bit of a creature of habit, and I can deal with change, but it's also nice to sort of know to predict what will happen with a certain group of people. But I also really value trust in the creative process, and so I value that the producer who I've worked with multiple times trusts me. And the DOP trusts me, I trust both of them, and I think it just allows for so much more, it just allows for, a kind of the creativity to sort of come, to kind of rise up and sort of like, bubble out and fester over it if it has to, without anyone kind of saying, that wasn't in the script, or that doesn't make any sense, or I don't know. Like I've definitely worked with people who have, gosh, they've really like put a downer on the set, you know, and I don't want to work like that. You know, I want to feel like I want to be excited to come to the set. I want to feel energized at the end of the day, and actually want everyone else to feel that way too. So, yeah, I like working with the same people. I've worked with the same editor for almost 14 years, and that's not to say that he and I haven't butt heads, you know, but it's the same thing. Like we really trust each other, and I value that. And sometimes I get antsy thinking, gosh, maybe some you know, creativity would open up with me if I would work with some other people. So I'm not against that, but I also think that in productions like the ones that I have done recently, they're tiny budgets, and you also you know, you're calling in favors, you know, and at the end of the day, it's like friends making a film. And so when you say, can you stay an extra hour so that we can get this shot? You know, they say, yeah, of course, let's do it. We're all in this together. They don't say, forget it. I don't know you. I don't owe you anything. It's the end of my day. Goodbye, you know? So, yeah, I mean, it feels really important. That feels important to sort of keep everybody close. I come from a big family. Maybe that's, I come from a big family. I sort of have a big family of my own. And I like to think of my film set as familial on some level. And I've been able to really cultivate and maintain good relationships with everybody that I've worked with. And I value that so much.